Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of Writing Notes. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Toulmin Model of Argument. So this is a specific method of argumentation developed by the British philosopher Stephen Toulmin. And what Toulmin was primarily concerned about was undoing a tradition of argument based on absolutes. So part of this we get from philosophy, part of this we get from histories of logic and things like this, scientific reasoning, that focused primarily on generating laws. Toulmin says, Toulmin's basic premise is that an absolute argument is always a weak argument. And what I mean by an absolute argument is either stated or implied that the argument being made applies in all cases, in all cases across the board without exception. So, student writers struggle to write effective introductions, for instance, becomes an absolute argument because when I say student writers, it implies that I mean all student writers. Now, the problem that Toulmin found with this is that a single counterexample disproves the argument. So, as long as you find one student writer who is great at writing introductions, my argument is null. Now, Toulmin gives us a system of argument, and it's a little bit complicated to talk through verbally, so I've drawn it out spatially. That's no good. Now, I realize that this spatial diagram is probably also really hard to figure out, so I'm going to try and take us through it step by step. Now, for Toulmin, there's three main components of the argument. So the first one is the claim. And the claim in the Toulmin model argument works basically the same way that a thesis does. And so I'm going to refer you back to my video on thesis statements. The next piece of the puzzle is data. And if you think about the claim evidence interpretation structure that I discussed in that video, claim evidence interpretation, this is your evidence. So your data is going to be things like statistics, theories, claims that experts have made, personal experience, personal observations, things like this. The next thing, and this is where it starts to get tricky, is your warrant. Now, what is the warrant? The warrant is, or rather, warrants are the sets of assumptions that underlie the connections between the data and the claim. So it's a bit like interpretation, except that with interpretation, this isn't something that has to be assumed to be true. So an interpretation is your explanation of why the claims support the data. Warrants can either be stated or unstated. So, this is, again, warrants are a bit tricky, because ultimately, assumptions, warrants underlie everything that we do. Every kind of argument that we make, every connection we see between things, and so on and so on. Some of them will always go unstated, but you definitely want some of them in your argument. So you want to make the major connections for your reader, even though it's not possible to make all of the connections that underlie everything at a sort of basic level of thinking. So those are the big three. Those are what Toulmin would call the enthymeme, is the claim, data, and warrants. Now, supporting these is a sort of larger structure to the argument consisting of another three parts. So one component of that is the backing. And the backing is directly related to the warrant. And this is somewhat like data supporting the warrant. So you have these sets of assumptions underlying the connections between your data and your claim, right? That's your warrant. The sets of assumptions, some of which are stated. And then what the backing does is it proves that your warrants are reliable. So this is sort of like evidence for your interpretation, if you think of it in a claim evidence interpretation structure. So this may be more statistics, it may be more specific data, it may be data with a slightly different focus, whatever it is, that's supporting the connections that you're making between your data and your claim. Good? I know it's a bit confusing to talk through it spatially. This actually makes a lot more sense when you look at it in an argument. So, alright, so the next thing on the agenda is the rebuttal. Now what the rebuttal does is it makes it clear that you're a savvy arguer, because a rebuttal is an anticipation of a counter-argument. So you say, basically you would say, others might say, or this is a way that people might misinterpret my argument, and I'm going to go ahead and make it clear right now what it is that I'm actually talking about. This can be set up more like a traditional counter-argument, where it would say, some might say, this thing is a good policy, or this will be an effective decision, or whatever it is, but they're wrong because. Or this might look more like a limitation on the argument, although that's kind of a gray area because of what I'm about to talk about after this. But this may seem like a limitation on an argument where you say, here's the outside edge of the policy that I'm proposing, or whatever it is. So one of the examples in our textbook it talks about animal testing with cosmetics. And in the argument, the rebuttal is that medical testing should still be acceptable because that's an essential benefit for human beings, but cosmetics testing should be banned because it's a non-essential benefit and it causes harm to test animals. So the rebuttal there is medical testing should still be legal. This is not saying that all testing should be banned. So that's the rebuttal. The qualifier, which is the last component of the Toulmin model, is actually one of the most important, although it may not seem like it on the surface. So there's two different approaches to qualifiers. One is sort of like the second version of the rebuttal, where it sets limits. Well, actually, qualifiers in general set limits on the argument. And what I mean by that are, they pull it out of the absolute. So, to go back to my earlier example, if I said, if rather than saying student writers struggle to write introductions, I said some student writers struggle to write introductions, some is a qualifier there. And it can be as simple as that, and it often is as simple as that. Some, many, in most cases, often, occasionally, few, whatever it is, some signal word or phrase that shows the audience, the reader, that you're not talking about every case, every time. You're only talking about some of the cases, some of the time. The other way that you can go with a qualifier is bigger, something more like a rebuttal, where you say, this is the limitation of the position that I'm advocating. There are some circumstances in which the position that I'm advocating does not apply. So again, this is the Toulmin model. I feel like it's really hard to talk through, but again, when you look at a piece of writing or when you look at a speech and you say, okay, that's the claim, that's some data, here are the warrants supporting that data, here's a qualifier, it's much, much easier to actually apply this to a real text than it is for me to talk through it verbally. But again, the key idea here is that we're creating a system of argumentation that doesn't rely on absolute arguments, that allows there to be some exceptions to the argument, that allows there to be limitations on the argument. Thanks for watching.